A distinguished magistrate hands down a crushing 60-year term to a young man he is convinced is a criminal, yet when a lost fragment of proof emerges from the shadows, it exposes a labyrinth of deceit so profound it rattles the very pillars of the law. The courtroom in Meridian City was stifling that afternoon. The atmosphere was thick, not merely with the summer humidity, but with the crushing gravity of the judgment about to fall. Every gaze was locked on Judge Silas Graves, a figure whose formidable name paved the way for him. He was not a man known for mercy or hesitation. His rulings were rapid, unyielding, and by all definitions absolute. At 62, with 35 years presiding, his face was as granite as his statutes, a monument to the innumerable destinies he had reshaped with the strike of his mallet. The accused, 24-year-old Leo Corren, stood at the counsel table, his fingers trembling ever so slightly, yet his stare remained unbroken. He wore the look of someone who had spent a lifetime attempting to validate his existence. Leo had ceaselessly asserted his innocence, even at the moment of his apprehension for the armed heist of a gem emporium that left one bystander fighting for breath. But today his voice was rendered meaningless. "Mr. Corren," Judge Graves commenced, his resonant bass vibrating through the chamber. "You stand condemned by a jury of your peers for offenses that have inflicted permanent scars on this society. Your conduct was not simply reckless, but orchestrated, and you have displayed no contrition." Leo's mother, huddled in the rear pew, choked back a cry. She had implored the tribunal to view him as more than a docket number, to remember the child she nurtured, the boy who once fantasized about battling fires. But the proof had screamed louder: eyewitness testimonies, camera recordings, and a nameless call that had sealed his doom. "I hereby sentence you to 60 years in the state penitentiary," Judge Graves announced, his gavel impacting the mahogany block. The noise reverberated, final and total. Leo remained statuesque, his lips pressed into a grim line as if containing words he realized would alter nothing. The gallery exploded into gasps, murmurs, and the scratching of journalists' pens, but for Leo, the universe had gone mute. He turned to glimpse his mother one final time before being guided away, his chained strides fading down the corridor. Judge Graves retreated to his private chambers, barring the door against the cacophony. He poured a mug of dark roast, staring into the vortex of the liquid as though it concealed some resolution. The day had been exhausting, but justice, in his view, had been delivered, or so he believed. Little did he suspect the reality he had just interred was about to claw its way to the light, refusing to remain buried. The trial had been legendary. Local media christened it the Corren heist, and it commanded the front pages for weeks. The felony itself was theatrical, a masked intruder charging into Sterling and Stone in downtown Meridian on a frantic Thursday afternoon, waving a firearm, and vanishing with over $150,000 in merchandise. The mayhem left one shop assistant, Arthur Penn, battling for survival after being hit in the crossfire. Leo Corren, a part-time mechanic with a spotless record, had been detained 2 weeks following the raid. An anonymous source alerted officials, asserting Leo matched the profile of the fugitive spotted escaping the vicinity. The prosecution illustrated a condemning portrait, linking him to the loot discovered in a rental locker filed under his name. Leo's court-assigned lawyer fought to gain ground against the avalanche of exhibits. There was the pixelated security video depicting a figure with a comparable physique and stride, witnesses who pledged they identified Leo's vocals, and perhaps most damning, the fingerprints lifted from the pistol abandoned at the scene. Still, Leo held to his innocence. "I didn't do this," he informed the jury during his examination. "I wasn't anywhere near that shop. I've never even handled a weapon." His alibi, a declaration that he was working a double rotation at the garage that day, disintegrated under inspection when his supervisor conceded on the stand that he couldn't confirm Leo's presence for the entire duration. The prosecution's concluding remarks were as cutting as they were relentless. "This is a man who believed he could outread the statutes," the district attorney proclaimed, marching before the jury. "But facts don't lie, prints don't lie, people don't lie." In opposition, Leo's defense sounded fragile, almost vanquished. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," his advocate begged, There are gaps in this narrative, doubts. Isn't that sufficient to grant this young man the benefit of the doubt? Yet his tone lacked belief, and the panel was not persuaded. The deliberation was rapid, less than 3 hours. The judgment, guilty on every charge. Leo didn't recoil as the foreman read the verdict, but the clenching of his jaw revealed the tempest raging within. Judge Graves, impartial as always, readied himself to pronounce a punishment he felt was warranted. He had observed hardened felons in his hall, men who had perfected the craft of deceit. To him, Leo was no exception. His eyes scanned the room before settling on Leo, as if hunting for any spark of regret or salvation. When the sentence was issued, it was as though the chamber itself exhaled. For the casualties and their kin, there was solace; for Leo and his mother, ruin. The system had spoken, and it was merciless. But as Judge Graves signed the confinement orders later that evening, a subtle flicker of something disturbed him, a persistent instinct he couldn't quite identify. He brushed it aside, attributing it to weariness. What Judge Graves couldn't foresee was that the trial was merely the prologue. The actual narrative was waiting for him, concealed in plain view, and it was about to transform everything. It began on a mundane Wednesday night. Judge Graves sat in his library, the amber light of a desk lamp brightening the chaotic piles of legal summaries and dossiers. Retirement had been occupying his thoughts recently, but tonight, there was labor to be completed. A fresh case involving law enforcement malpractice had arrived on his desk, and the accusations were severe enough to demand additional focus. As he flipped through the papers, something snagged his attention, an evidence register from a previous inquiry. At first, it was just a fleeting look, a trivial fragment in the ocean of documentation, but then a name jumped out at him: Leo Corren. Graves leaned back in his seat, frowning. It wasn't rare for names to reappear in unconnected matters, but this felt distinct. He turned the sheet, his heartbeat accelerating. The log itemized the contents of a police secure locker, listing objects seized during a separate theft investigation that had occurred around the same period as the Sterling and Stone affair. One object stood out, a firearm. The specifications matched the weapon utilized in the robbery for which Leo had been condemned. The anomaly was this: this gun hadn't been presented as evidence during Leo's trial. In reality, it hadn't been referenced at all. Graves leaned in, the burden of his revelation bearing down on him. He cross-referenced the serial number with the trial transcripts still vivid in his recollection. It was a precise match, same model, same abrasions on the barrel. Yet the record asserted this pistol had been confiscated during an unrelated detention 2 days after the heist. How is that feasible? He whispered to himself, his heart galloping as he assembled the ramifications. If this weapon had been in police containment, it could not have been employed in the Sterling and Stone raid. And if it wasn't the weapon, then whose prints were upon it? He couldn't shake the sensation that something was wrong. Graves had spent decades maneuvering through the maze of the judicial framework, and he understood how effortlessly crucial nuances could be submerged. But this wasn't an error, it felt deliberate. Resolved to obtain answers, he demanded the complete dossier for the unconnected theft. It arrived the following dawn, a dense binder overflowing with patrol reports, snapshots, and witness declarations. The deeper Graves excavated, the more the strands began to untangle. The arresting officer in the separate matter was the identical detective who had testified during Leo's trial. And then there was the anonymous hint. Graves had barely spared it a second thought during the proceedings, but now it appeared blindingly suspect. He ordered a subpoena for the hotline logs, his anxiety mounting with every elapsed hour. When the files finally materialized, Graves' blood turned to ice. The call hadn't originated from a random civilian, it had stemmed from a disposable mobile registered under that same detective's name. The walls of his study seemed to constrict as the epiphany struck him: Leo Corren had been framed. The proof had been engineered, the testimony choreographed. Graves' stomach twisted as he contemplated the 60-year term he had mandated, the fractured existence of a young man who might have been blameless the entire time. Graves had always glorified himself on sustaining the law, but now the law felt like sinking sand beneath his boots. He knew what was required, but the route ahead was fraught with danger. As the gravity of his findings settled, Graves made a decision. He would delve further, regardless of the price. The truth insisted on it, and he was not about to let it slip away. Judge Graves hadn't slept much since unearthing the contradictions in Leo Corren's case. His mornings commenced with mounds of legal scriptures, and his nights concluded with a journal filled with hurriedly scrawled observations. But the more he scrutinized, the murkier the image became. The initial fracture in the barrier occurred when Graves met with an old associate, retired investigator Victor Cole, over coffee in a dimly lit eatery off the main highway. Graves spread out his discoveries. Cole, a man with a stern disposition and a talent for smelling out dishonesty, listened closely. "This isn't merely incompetence, Silas," Cole stated, pushing his mug away. "If what you're articulating is factual, someone went to extreme lengths to ensure that kid took the blame." Graves nodded sternly. "I need confirmation, Victor. Concrete confirmation." Cole agreed to assist, and within days the pair were neck-deep in precinct archives, witness accounts, and internal memos. What they located was astounding: fabricated reports, absent evidence registers, and witness affirmations that had been modified to fit the prosecution's script. One witness specifically caught Graves' focus, a shop assistant who had originally pinpointed another male as the perpetrator before subsequently altering his statement to implicate Leo. Cole tracked the man to a cramped flat on the fringe of the city. When they challenged him, his narrative came tumbling out. "I didn't want to do it," the man admitted, his hands shaking. "But Detective Harrow, he pressured me, said if I didn't, I'd be booked for obstruction. I didn't have an option." Detective Harrow. The name sent a surge of fury through Graves. This was the same officer who had submitted the bogus tip and buried the evidence. As Graves and Cole dug further, they revealed a pattern. Harrow had a history of dubious methods, intimidating observers, manufacturing proof, and coercing admissions. Yet his file remained pristine, shielded by layers of bureaucratic armor. The breakthrough arrived when Cole managed to retrieve erased emails from Harrow's official account. One message in particular stood out. It was directed to the district attorney and outlined a scheme to guarantee a conviction in the Sterling and Stone case. Attached was a roster of invented evidence and manipulated witness declarations. Graves felt a rush of wrath as he read the correspondence. The very system he had dedicated his life to was decayed to its core, and yet there was no time for despair. He possessed the verification he needed to act. But revealing the truth wouldn't be simple. Harrow had potent allies within the force, and Graves knew that going public could cost him everything: his career, his standing, even his security. Yet, as he thought of Leo Corren sitting in a detention cell for a felony he didn't commit, the choice was lucid. "We go public," Graves told Cole one night as they assessed their findings. "Whatever it takes." The following day, Graves filed a petition to reopen Leo's case, attaching the damning proof against Harrow. The motion sent shockwaves through the courthouse, but Graves wasn't finished. He also lodged a formal grievance with the Department of Justice, demanding an independent inquiry into Harrow and the Meridian Police Department. The backlash was rapid. Graves received nameless threats warning him to retreat, his peers distanced themselves, and the press began to interrogate his agenda. But Graves stood solid. The reality was out now, and there was no turning back. But as the tempest swelled around him, Graves realized that the struggle was far from concluded. The toughest conflicts were yet to arrive. The fallout from Judge Graves' motion was instant and volatile. Local headlines screamed allegations of corruption within the department, and public fury spread like wildfire. For the first time in decades, Graves felt the scorch of inspection aimed squarely at him. Some hailed him as a champion for seeking rightness. Others branded him a traitor to the order he'd sworn to maintain. But it wasn't just public sentiment that turned against him. Graves began receiving calls at odd hours, heavy silence on the other end before the connection died. One dawn, he stepped outside to find his vehicle tires slashed, a crude note scrawled on the glass. "Drop it or else." Graves knew the hazards of chasing the truth, but he hadn't anticipated the menace to escalate so swiftly. Still, he refused to be cowed. He'd seen too many lives wrecked by the sort of systemic failures he was now facing. Leo Corren's face haunted his reflections, young, resolute, and heartbreakingly resigned to a destiny he hadn't earned. Meanwhile, Detective Harrow wasn't going down without a brawl. Through his solicitor, Harrow denied the charges, claiming Graves' motion was a groundless assault aimed at tarnishing his career. "This is nothing more than a grudge," Harrow declared in a televised interview, his slick manner a stark contrast to the mounting proof against him. Graves watched the broadcast from his living room, his jaw tightening with irritation. The lies were audacious and calculated, but he held something Harrow didn't: the truth. As the inquiry progressed, Cole unearthed a critical fragment of evidence: security camera footage from a car parked near the jewelry store, recorded on the day of the theft. The video, which had somehow never been submitted during the trial, displayed a man matching Harrow's physical build leaving the scene with a duffel bag. Graves' heart pounded as he reviewed the tape. It wasn't just exculpatory, it was damning. With this, the pieces fell into place. The robbery hadn't been a random act of violence, it had been orchestrated by Harrow himself. The next step was clear but perilous. Graves called for an emergency hearing to present the fresh evidence. The courtroom was taut as the footage played on a monitor before the packed gallery. Gasps rippled through the throng as the realization sank in. "This man," Graves said, gesturing to the screen, "is the same detective who led the investigation against Leo Corren. He manipulated the evidence, coerced witnesses, and framed an innocent man to cover his own tracks." The reaction was immediate. Reporters scrambled to capture the instant, their flashes illuminating the courtroom like lightning. Harrow, sitting in the gallery with his lawyer, looked pale but defiant. "You're making a mistake, Graves," he hissed as he was escorted out in cuffs. "You don't know what you've started." The confrontation left Graves shaken but resolute. The case was now in the hands of a higher court, and Leo Corren's conviction was being re-examined. But Graves knew this wasn't the end. It was merely the commencement of a much larger battle. As the courtroom vacated, Graves realized the weight of what he'd uncovered. The truth was out, but the fight for fairness was far from over. Weeks later, Judge Graves sat in the same tribunal where Leo Corren had been sentenced, but this time, the atmosphere felt distinct. The gallery was packed with journalists, activists, and Leo's family, all waiting for the magistrate presiding over the retrial to make a ruling. Leo, now thinner and visibly aged from his duration in confinement, sat quietly at the defense table. Despite the ordeal, his posture was steady, his gaze unwavering. Graves felt a lump form in his throat as he watched the young man who had been the axis of this storm, who had endured so much for a crime he hadn't committed. The evidence Graves and Cole had unearthed was irrefutable: the surveillance footage, falsified reports, coerced testimonies. It all pointed to a web of corruption that had framed Leo and shielded the real criminals. As the presiding judge announced the decision to overturn Leo's conviction, the room erupted in applause and tears. Leo stood, his hands trembling as his mother rushed to embrace him. For a moment, time seemed to halt. Graves, seated quietly in the rear of the courtroom, allowed himself a rare smile. Justice had finally been served, but the journey had come at a cost. In the days that followed, the fallout spread far and wide. Detective Harrow faced criminal charges for his actions, and an independent investigation into the department revealed a culture of corruption that had gone unchecked for years. The case sparked nationwide calls for reform, with Graves' role becoming a rallying cry for accountability within the justice system. Despite the accolades, Graves remained introspective. He knew this victory was just one piece of a much larger puzzle. The system he had once trusted was flawed, but it wasn't beyond repair, and he was determined to spend the rest of his career fighting to make it better. As for Leo, his journey was only beginning. Freed from the burden of a wrongful conviction, he vowed to dedicate his life to helping others who had been unjustly imprisoned. His story became a beacon of hope for those who believed in the power of resilience and the pursuit of truth. The story of Leo Corren and Judge Graves is a powerful reminder that justice is not infallible. It requires vigilance, courage, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. If this story moved you, consider supporting organizations that work to free the wrongfully convicted and advocate for systemic reform. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more stories that inspire and challenge the way we see the world, because sometimes, the fight for justice doesn't end in the courtroom, it begins there.